Okay. 2 p.m., 24 May. Weekly Marks. We're continuing or finishing off Karl Marx Capital Volume 1, Chapter 24, the 2024 edition. So the chapter is called The So-Called Original Accumulation. We read, as I recall, up to this particular point. Oh, lo those many weeks ago. How the agricultural revolution reacted on industry, the creation of a domestic market for industrial capital. As we've seen, the expropriation and expulsion of agricultural workers, which kept recurring in waves, supplied urban industry with large numbers of proletarians not bound by guild rules, a happy circumstance that made old Anderson believe in direct interventions of providence. In his History of Commerce, this author, Adam Anderson, shouldn't be confused with James Anderson. We must devote a bit more time to examining this aspect of original accumulation. As the rural population of independent, self-supporting peasants grew sparser, the ranks of the industrial proletariat grew more crowded, just as, according to Geoffrey Saint-Hilaire, cosmic matter becomes denser in one place when it becomes more rarefied elsewhere. Even though the number of people cultivating the soil fell, agricultural production stayed the same or increased because the revolution in rural property relations was accompanied by better cultivation, increased cooperation, and a greater concentration of the means of production. And moreover, because agricultural wage laborers had to work with greater intensity while also needing to give up more and more of the land they had cultivated for themselves. When part of the rural population was set free, their former food supply was set thus free as well. It was transformed into a material element of variable capital. With the ground pulled out from under him, the peasant now had to get the value of his means of subsistence from his new lord, the industrial capitalist, in the form of wages. This also happened with the raw materials with which local agricultural production supplied industry. They became a component of constant capital. Suppose some Westphalian peasants are violently expropriated and driven from the land, while the rest stay behind and are turned into day laborers working for large-scale farmers. During the time of Frederick II, all Westphalian peasants were flax spinners, whether or not they were silk spinners as well. Large flax spinning and weaving enterprises sprung up. They are where everyone set free now performs wage weaving enterprises spring up. They are where, the flax looks the same. Not even a fiber has changed, but a new social soul has entered its body, and it now makes up part of the master manufacturer's constant capital. The flax used to be divided among a great many small producers who cultivated it themselves, also spinning it with their families. It is now concentrated in the hands of one capitalist, who has others spin and weave it for him. The extra labor expended in spinning was realized in extra income earned by countless peasant families, and also in taxes pour le roi de Prusse, when Frederick II occupied the throne. Now, it's now realized in the profits of a few capitalists. The spindles and looms, which were scattered all over the countryside, are now crammed together in a few large labor barracks, just as the workers and the raw materials are. The spindles and looms and raw materials are thereby transformed. Once they, once they were the means that allowed spinners and weavers to live independently. They now have become the means for commanding those workers and squeezing out of them labor that goes unpaid. When we look at large manufacturing workshops or large farms, nothing tells us how they were created, namely by the consolidation of many small sites of production and the expropriation of many small independent producers. But unprejudiced observers won't be fooled. During the time of Mirabeau, that lion of the Revolution, people still spoke of large manufacturing workshops as manufactures réunies or consolidated workshops, just as we speak of consolidated fields. We only pay attention, says Mirabeau, to large factories where hundreds of men work under one director and which are commonly called manufactures réunies. Those where a very large number of workers each work separately and each on his own account are scarcely considered. They're put at an infinite distance from the others. This is a very big mistake, for the latter alone represent a truly important component of natural prosperity. The combined workshop, fabrique réunie, will make one or two entrepreneurs prodigiously rich, but the workers will only be more or less paid day laborers and will have no part in the good of the enterprise. In the discrete workshop slash isolated workshop, the fabrique séparée, on the other hand, no one will become rich, but many workers will be comfortable. The thrifty and industrious will be able to amass a small capital to save some resources for the birth of a child, for an illness, for themselves, or for one of their own. The number of thrifty and industrious workers will increase because they will see in good conduct, in activity, a means of essentially improving their situation and not of obtaining a small increase in wages which can never be an important object for the future and whose only product is to put men in a position to live a little better, but only from day to day. Manufactures séparées, most combined with small-scale farming, are the only free ones. Expropriating and evicting part of the agricultural population not only set workers free for industrial capital, along with their means of subsistence and the materials of their labor, it also created the domestic market. The farmer now sells as a large number of commodities the means of subsistence and raw materials that, for the most part, the rural workers who produced them or worked with them used to consume directly as their means of subsistence. The manufacturing workshops themselves supply them with the market. At the same time, where many scattered customers once bought the various local things they needed from many small producers, those customers are now concentrated into a large market for industrial capital. And moreover, many of the articles formerly produced in the countryside are now transformed into articles produced in the manufacturing workshop, while the countryside becomes a market for them. So, when formerly self-supporting peasants are expropriated and separated from their means of production, we find that the rural subsidiary trades are destroyed as well, and manufacturing and agriculture are decoupled. The two processes of separation go hand in hand. Yet the manufacturing period proper didn't actually witness a radical transformation. Readers will recall that the manufacturing system managed to take control of a nation's production only quite partially, and that it always needed urban craft labor and domestic side industries in rural districts, relying on them as a broad foundation. If the manufacturing system killed off forms of these industries in certain places and areas of production, it resurrected them elsewhere because it still, to some extent, depended on them to prepare the raw materials it worked with. That system thus brought about a new class of small villagers who cultivated the land as a side occupation, but who mainly supported themselves by performing industrial labor. They made products to sell to manufacturing workshops, either directly or through a merchant. This is one cause, if not the chief cause, of something that initially confuses students of English history. From the last third of the 15th century onward, we find relentless complaining, only rarely interrupted, about the encroachments of capitalist farming on the countryside and the gradual annihilation of the peasantry. On the other hand, those peasants always turned up again, albeit with their ranks thinner and in a state that kept getting worse. The main cause of this phenomenon is as follows. At certain times, England primarily grew wheat. At others, it primarily bred cattle. Peasant cultivation ebbed and flowed with the alternation of these periods, which sometimes lasted for more than half a century and sometimes for only a couple of decades. It was large-scale industry driven by machines that first provided capitalist agriculture with a consistent foundation and radically expropriated the vast majority of the rural population. Furthermore, it fully decoupled farming and rural domestic industry, pulling the latter up by its roots, namely spinning and weaving. Thus, it was also large-scale industry that first conquered the entire domestic market for industrial capital. Number six, the genesis of industrial capitalists. The industrial capitalist was formed less gradually than the capitalist farmer. No doubt some small guild masters and still more small independent artisans and even wage laborers metamorphosed into small capitalists. Then, by progressively increasing their exploitation of wage labor and in turn their accumulation of capital, they became capitalists sans phrase. When capitalist production was in its infancy, things were often done as they had been done during the infancy of the medieval town, where the question of whether an escaped serf should be a master or a servant was frequently settled by asking, did he flee before or after some escaped serf whose fate was also hanging in the balance? The snail's pace of progress here didn't accord with the commercial requirements of the New World market, which arose in the late 15th century as a result of the explorers' great discoveries. But two different forms of capital were handed down from the Middle Ages, usury capital and merchant capital. And they ripened in the most diverse economic formations of society, functioning as a capital quand même, uh, before the era of the capitalist mode of production had begun. The money capital that was created by usury capital and trade couldn't initially turn into industrial capital. Feudal relations in the countryside and guild relations in the towns prevented that. Those barriers fell away when the bands of feudal retainers dissolved and the rural population was expropriated, with some people being driven off the land altogether. Novel manufacturing workshops were established at seaports or places in the countryside beyond the control of the old municipalities and their guilds. Hence, in England, the corporate towns waged a bitter struggle against these new industrial hotbeds. What characterizes the dawn of the era of capitalist production? Gold and silver were discovered in America. The native population there was wiped out, enslaved, and entombed in mines. India was conquered and plundered, and Africa was turned into a commercial hunting preserve with dark-skinned people as the prey. These idyllic processes largely constitute original accumulation. Following right behind them was the European nations' commercial war, whose battlefield encompassed the entire globe. This war began with the revolt of the Netherlands against Spain, swelled to gigantic dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin War, and continues into the present day as the Opium Wars against China. The different aspects of original accumulation were put in motion by, in particular, Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England, more or less in chronological order. In the late 17th century England, they were methodically combined in a number of systems: the colonial system, the national debt system, the modern tax system, and the system of protectionism. These methods relied in part on the most brutal violence. For example, the colonial system did. But they all employed the power of the state, the concentrated, organized violence of society to quicken the transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, as though in a hothouse, and to shorten the transitions. Violence is the midwife for every society pregnant with a new one. It is, in fact, a kind of economic power. William Howitt, a man who specialized in being a Christian, said of the Christian colonial system, the barbarities and desperate outrages of the so-called Christian race throughout every region of the world and upon every people that they have been able to subdue are not to be paralleled by those of any other race, however fierce, however untaught, and however reckless of mercy and of shame in any age of the earth. The history of Dutch colonial administration, and Holland was the model capitalist nation in the 17th century, is one of the most extraordinary relations of treachery, bribery, massacre, and meanness. Nothing is more characteristic of it than the system of stealing people in Celebes to get slaves for Java. The Dutch used trained man-stealers, with the thief, the interpreter, and the immediate seller functioning as the main agents in the trade, while native princes were the main sellers. The stolen youths were kept in secret prisons on Celebes until they were old enough to be sent away on slave ships. An official report says this one town of Macassar, for example, is full of secret prisons, the one more dismal than the other, which are stuffed with wretches. The victims of avarice and tyranny who, chained in fetters, are violently torn from their families. Looking to gain possession of Malacca, the Dutch bribed the Portuguese governor, who in 1641 let them into the town. They promptly went to his house and assassinated him so as to abstain from paying £21,875 in bribe money. Wherever the Dutch set foot, desolation and depopulation ensued. The population of Banjuwangi, a Javanese province, numbered over 80,000 in 1750. Only 8,000 inhabitants remained in 1811. This is what du commerce looks like. As is well known, the British East India Company wasn't just given political control of India, it got exclusive monopolies on tea trade, Chinese trade in general, and shipping goods to and from Europe. But the high officials in the company had their own monopolies on trade along the coasts of India, between the islands, and within India too. The monopolies on salt, opium, betel, and other commodities proved to be inexhaustible gold mines. The officials themselves set prices and stole from the unfortunate Hindus at will. Moreover, the governor general participated in these private dealings. His favorites got contracts under conditions that they exploited more cleverly than alchemists, for they in fact made gold out of nothing. Great fortunes sprang up in a day like mushrooms. Original accumulation occurred without even a shilling being advanced. The trial of Warren Hastings abounded with such cases. There was this one, for example. An opium contract was awarded to a certain Sullivan, even though he was about to travel on official business to a part of India far away from the opium districts. Sullivan sold his contract to a Ben for £40,000. Ben, for his part, sold the contract on the very same day for £60,000. The final buyer, who actually executed the contract, maintained that he still made an outsized profit. According to a list presented to Parliament, the East India Company and its officials received gifts from the Indians worth £6 million between 1757 and 1766. In 1769 and 1770, the English manufactured a famine by buying up all the rice and selling it only at ridiculous prices. Now, of course, the abuse of native populations reached its nadir in the plantation colonies established to produce export products, such as the West Indies, and in rich, populous countries that were heavily plundered, such as Mexico and India. But in the actual colonies, too, the Christian character of original accumulation made no secret of itself. In 1703, the Puritans, those sober virtuosos of Protestantism, enacted decrees in their assembly that put a £40 premium on every Indian scalp and every captured red skin. In 1722, the premium for an Indian scalp was raised to £100, and in 1744, when Massachusetts Bay declared a certain tribe to be rebels, the following prices were established. For the scalp of a male person 12 or older, £100 in new currency. For a male prisoner, £105. For women and children prisoners, £55. For women's and children's scalps, £50. The colonial system returned the favor decades later, although the ones affected were the pious Pilgrim descendants, who had by then become rebels themselves, encouraged by the English, and for English money, the Indians tomahawked them. Britain's Parliament declared that bloodhounds and scalping counted among the means which God and nature had put into her power. The colonial system fostered the development of shipping and trade, ripened them fast, ripening them fast. Companies called monopolia, cited by Luther, served as powerful mechanisms for increasing the concentration of capital. In fact, the colonies secured for the nascent manufacturing workshops both a market for their goods and accumulation boosted by a market monopoly, while the treasures acquired outside Europe by directly robbing, enslaving, and murdering native people flowed back to the motherland where they were transformed into capital. Holland, the first country to fully develop the colonial system, rose to the peak of its commercial greatness as early as 1648. It it nearly had sole possession of the Indian trade, and the trade between the southeast and northwest of Europe. Its fisheries, shipping, and manufacturing workshops surpassed those of all the other European countries put together. The total capital of the Republic may have been greater than that of all of the rest of Europe put together. Gulick forgot to add that by 1648, Holland's population was already poorer, more overworked, and oppressed more brutally than all the other people in Europe put together. With one mighty shove, the colonial system sent all the old idols tumbling overboard at the same time. It proclaimed profit making to be humanity's sole and ultimate purpose. Here is where the modern systems of national debt and credit were born. Cobbett, Doubleday, and many other writers have been led astray by the conspicuous role that the system of national debt and the modern system of taxation played in the transformation of society's wealth into capital. The expropriation of independent producers and the oppression of wage laborers. They have made the mistake of seeing those systems as the root cause of all the misery the people currently endure. When national debt sprang up, so did an international credit system that often conceals the source of the original accumulation in a particular country. For example, the cruelties committed by the Venetian system of theft were the hidden foundation that allowed Holland to acquire vast wealth as capital. For when Venice was in decline, it loaned Holland huge sums of money. The same thing happened with Holland and England. By the beginning of the 18th century, Holland's manufacturing workshops had been far surpassed, and it ceased to be the world's dominant commercial and industrial power. From 1701 to 1776, one of its main branches of business was lending enormous sums of capital, especially to England, its more powerful rival, which was now doing that for the United States. Some of the capital that arrives in the United States today with no birth certificate was, just yesterday, the capitalized blood of English children. The system of protectionism was an artificial way to manufacture industrial manufacturers, expropriate independent workers, capitalize the national means of production and subsistence, and forcibly shorten the transition from an old-fashioned mode of production to a modern one. The European states fought one another tooth and nail over the patent to this invention, and once the states began to serve the profiteers, they did so with abandon. They not only pillaged their own people both directly with export premiums and indirectly with protective tariffs, they also violently cleared away all industry in the dependent neighboring colonies or countries. England got rid of Ireland's wool production, for example. On the European continent, the process was greatly simplified, with Colbert's operation functioning as a model. There, part of industry's original capital came straight from the state treasury. Why, cried Mirabeau, look so far back to search for the cause of Saxony's pre-war manufacturing glory? 180 million in debts contracted by the sovereigns. The colonial system, national debt, heavy taxes, protectionism, commercial wars, and so on. These offspring of the manufacturing period proper grew to gigantic proportions during the early days of large-scale industry, whose birth was celebrated with child theft carried out on a Herodian scale. Sir Frederick Morton Eden might have maintain a blasé attitude towards the horrors that the expropriation of the land from the agricultural population entailed from the last third of the 15th century until his own time, i.e., the end of the 18th century, and he certainly seemed pleased in extending his congratulations on this necessary process, which had to take place before capitalist agriculture and the due proportion between arable land and pasture land could be established. And yet, he failed to offer the same kind of economic insight into why it was necessary to commit child theft and institute child slavery in order to transform the manufacturing system into the factory system and bring about the true relation between capital and labor power. Eden wrote, quote, it may be perhaps be the true relation between capital, it may be worthy of the attention of the public to consider whether any manufacture which, in order to be carried on successfully, requires that cottages and workhouses should be ransacked for poor children, that they should be employed by turns during the greater part of the night and robbed of that rest which, though indispensable to all, is most required by the young, and that numbers of both sexes, of different ages and dispositions, should be collected together in such a manner that the contagion of example cannot but lead to profligacy and debauchery, will add to the sum of individual or national felicity. In the counties of Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and more particularly in Lancashire, says Fielden, the newly invented machinery was used in large factories built on the sides of streams capable of turning the water wheel. Thousands of hands were suddenly required in these places, remote from towns, and Lancashire in particular being till then but comparatively thinly populated and barren, a population was all she now wanted. The small and nimble fingers of little children being by far the most in request, the custom instantly sprang up of procuring apprentices from the different parish workhouses of London, Birmingham, and elsewhere. Many, many thousands of these little hapless creatures were sent down into the north, being of the age of 7 to the age of 13 or 14 years old. The custom was for the master, i.e., the child thief, to clothe his apprentices and to feed and lodge them in an apprentice house near the factory. Overseers were appointed to see to the works, whose interest it was to work the children to the utmost because their pay was in proportion to the quantity of work that they could exact. Cruelty, of course, was the consequence. In many of the manufacturing districts, but particularly Lancashire's, cruelties the most heartrending were practiced upon the unoffending and friendless creatures who were thus consigned to the charge of the master manufacturers. Some lives were cut short by excess of work, the children were flogged, fettered, and tortured in the most exquisite refinement of cruelty. They were, in many cases, starved to the bone while flogged to their work, and even in some instances were driven to commit suicide. The beautiful and romantic valleys of Derbyshire, Nottingham, and Lancashire, secluded from the public eye, became the dismal solitudes of torture and of many a murder. The profits of the manufacturers were enormous, but this only whetted the appetite that it should have satisfied, and therefore the manufacturers had recourse to an expedient that seemed to secure to them those profits without any possibility of limit. They began the practice of what was termed night working, that is, having tired one set of hands by working them throughout the day, they had another set ready to go working throughout the night. The day set getting into the beds that night set had just quitted, and in their turn again, the night set getting into the beds that the day set quitted in the morning. It is a common tradition in Lancashire that the beds never got cold. As capitalist production developed during the manufacturing period, public opinion in Europe lost its last remnants of shame and conscience. Nations cynically boasted about every misdeed that helped them accumulate capital. Just read the naive commercial annals of the righteous Mr. Anderson. What does he trumpet as a great victory for English statecraft? Well, that at the Peace of Utrecht, England forced Spain in the Asiento Treaty to grant it permission to ship slaves from Africa to Spanish America. It had previously been limited selling African slaves in the English West Indies. England now acquired the right to supply Spanish America with 4,800 Negroes a year until 1743. This also provided British smuggling with official cover. Liverpool grew fat on the slave trade, its particular method for bringing about original accumulation. Even today, Liverpool quality have remained the Pindars of the slave trade, which, as Dr. Aitken notes in the work just cited, has coincided with that spirit of bold adventure which has characterized the trade of Liverpool and rapidly carried it to its present state of prosperity, has occasioned vast employment for shipping and sailors, and greatly augmented the demand for the manufactures of the country. In 1730, Liverpool used 15 ships for the slave trade. By 1751, the number had risen to 53. In 1760, it was 74. The city employed 96 ships for the slave trade in 1770 and 132 in 1792. The cotton industry introduced child slavery in England, while in the United States it spurred the transformation of the older, essentially patriarchal slave system into a commercial system of exploitation. Thus, the slavery sans phrase of the New World functioned as the pedestal that the veiled slavery of European wage laborers couldn't do without. Tante mollis erat, to unleash the eternal natural laws of the capitalist mode of production, to complete the process that separates the worker from what he needs to perform his labor, to transform society's means of production and subsistence into capital on one side of the capital relation, while turning the majority of the people into wage laborers on the opposite side, into the free laboring poor, that artificial product of modern history. If, according to Auger, money comes into the world with natural bloodstains on one cheek, capital is born with blood and dirt oozing from every pore. Section 7, the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation. What does the original accumulation of capital, or its historical genesis, amount to in the end? Original accumulation means that slaves and serfs become wage laborers. In other words, a mere change of form occurs. Beyond that, all it entails is the expropriation of the people directly engaged in production, i.e., the dissolution of private property based on one's own labor. The foundation of small-scale industry is that the worker owns his means of production, and small-scale industry is a condition that has to be in place for social production and the worker's own free individuality to develop. We also find this mode of production under the slave system, serfdom, and in other situations of dependence. However, it blooms, operates with maximum energy, and battles its way to its adequate classic form only when the worker is the free private proprietor of the things he needs to perform his labor, and sets those things in motion himself. Only where the peasant owns the land he cultivates, or the artisan owns the instrument he wields with the skill of a virtuoso. This mode of production presupposes that the land and other means of production are split up, which excludes concentrating them. Thus, cooperation can't take place. The division of labor can't occur within a single production process. Society can't come to dominate and regulate nature, and it is also impossible for social productive powers to freely develop. In the realms of both production and society, this mode of industry is compatible only with narrow, spontaneously arising limits. Once it reaches a certain level, it brings into being the material means of its own destruction. New powers and passions begin to stir deep within the belly of the society in which they feel themselves to be fettered. It must be destroyed. It is destroyed. The individual and scattered means of production are concentrated, and thus the diminutive holdings of the many are transformed into the giant holdings of the few, while the land and means of subsistence and instruments of labor are thereby expropriated from the great majority of the people. This, the old society's destruction, a frightful and difficult process of expropriation, constitutes the prehistory of capital. Of the array of violent methods it involves, we have discussed only those that play an epical role in capital's original accumulation. The expropriation of the people directly engaged in production was carried out with the most ruthless barbarism and driven by the nastiest, pettiest, most hateful and hideous passions. What was once the private property of an independent working individual, someone fused, so to speak, with the things he needs to perform his labor. In other words, private property that someone has worked for is supplanted by capitalist private property, i.e., private property based on the exploitation of someone else's formerly free labor. The moment this process of transformation has broken down the old society widely and deeply enough, the moment workers are turned into proletarians and the things required for their labor have been turned into capital, and finally the moment the capitalist mode of production stands on its own 2 feet, the process whereby labor becomes social is altered, as is the transformation of the land and the other means of production into socially exploited and thus shared means of production. Hence, a change likewise occurs in the way private owners are expropriated. These processes all have a different form from this point on. No longer is the self-supporting worker the target of expropriation. Its target is now the capitalist who exploits many workers. This expropriation is brought about by none other than the operation of capitalist production's own immanent laws, which entails the concentration of individual masses of capital. One capitalist kills off many others. A number of developments advance along with this concentration, or as the expropriation of many capitalists by a few does. The cooperative form of the labor process on an ever increasing scale, the conscious technological application of science, the systematic collective exploitation of the earth, the transformation of the means of labor into means of labor that can be used only collectively, and economizing in the use of all the means of production by employing them as the common means of combined social labor. The number of capitalist magnates falls continuously, and the remaining ones monopolize and usurp for themselves all the advantages that this process of transformation holds. Meanwhile, misery increases, as does the amount of pressure, subjugation, degradation, and exploitation inflicted upon the constantly growing working class. But the outrage felt by the members of that class also increases, and they are brought together and are trained and organized by the mechanism of capitalist production itself. Capital's monopoly now shackles the very mode of production that had flourished because of and under it. The concentration of the means of production and the socialization of labor reached the point where neither process is compatible with its capitalist shell. This bursts, and now the bell tolls for capitalist private property. The expropriators are expropriated. The capitalist mode of production and appropriation, and therefore capitalist private property, is the first negation of individual private property based on one's own labor. In a process that has the necessity of any natural process, capitalist production then produces its own negation, the negation of the negation. See Hegel. This restores individual property, which, however, is now based on the achievement of the capitalist era, namely, the cooperation of free workers and their collective ownership of the land and the means of production that are produced by labor itself. The process whereby an earlier form of private property that is fragmented and based on an individual's own labor, is transformed into the capitalist kind is, of course, incomparably longer, harsher, and more difficult than the one whereby capitalist private property, already based on a social system of production, is transformed into social property. In the first case, a few usurpers expropriate a great many people. In the second, a great many people expropriate a few usurpers. We get to the end of chapter 24. Now, these are the endnotes. Number one, in Italy, where capitalist production developed first, it also happened that serfdom dissolved earlier than elsewhere. The Italian serf was emancipated before he had secured any prescriptive right to the land. When he was emancipated, which instantly turned him into an uprooted proletarian without any individual rights, any legal rights, he found a new master ready and waiting for him in Italy's towns, many of which had existed before Roman times. Even at the end of the 17th century, more than four-fifths, 80% of England's total population was still agricultural. It's Macaulay's History of England, 1854. I mention Macaulay because, as a systematic falsifier of history, he generally circumcises such facts as much as possible. Number three, one must never forget that even the serf not only owned the piece of land attached to his house, although he was, of course, a tribute paying owner, but he was also a co-proprietor of the common land. The peasant in Silesia is a serf. Nevertheless, such serfs owned common lands. It has not yet been possible to commit the Silesians to the division of communes, while in the Neumark case, in the Neumark, there is hardly a village where this division is not being carried out with the greatest success. 1788 Mirabeau's on the Prussian monarchy. With its purely, number four, with its purely feudal organization of landed property and its advanced small-scale agriculture, Japan offers a much truer picture of the European Middle Ages than all our history books, which bourgeois prejudices have shaped so decisively. It is far too easy to be quote unquote liberal at the expense of the Middle Ages. Number five, um, note added to the second edition in his Utopia, Thomas More writes of the strange land where sheep devour men. Number six, note added to the second edition, Bacon discusses the connection between a free, prosperous peasantry and a good infantry. This did, this did wonderfully concern the might and mannerhood of the kingdom, to have the farms, as it were, of a standard sufficient to maintain an able body out of penury, and did in effect amortize a great part of the lands of the kingdom unto the hold and occupation of the yeomanry or middle people of a condition between gentlemen and cottagers and peasants. For it hath been held by the general opinion of men of best judgment in the wars, that the principal strength of an army consisteth in the infantry or foot, and to make good infantry it requireth men bred not in a servile or indigent fashion, but in some free and plentiful manner. Therefore, if a state run most to noblemen and gentlemen, and that the husbandmen and ploughmen be but as their workfolks and laborers, or else mere cottagers, which are but housed beggars, you may have a good cavalry, but never good stable bands of foot. And this is to be seen in France and Italy and some other parts abroad, where in effect all is noblesse or peasantry, insomuch as they are enforced to employ mercenary bands of Switzers and the like for their battalions of foot, whereby it also comes to pass that those nations have much people and few soldiers. This is a verbatim reprint from Kennett's England, edition 1710, reproduced in London in 1870, the reign of Henry VII. Dr. Hunter is number seven. The quantity of land assigned under the old laws would now be judged too great for laborers, and rather as likely to convert them into small farmers. This is from George Roberts, The Social History of the People of the Southern Counties of England in the Past Centuries, 1856. Number eight, the right of the poor to share in the tithe is established by the tenure of ancient statutes. Tucker, Volume 2. Number nine, William Cobbett, A History of the Protestant Reformation. Number 10, we can see the spirit of Protestantism in the following situation, among other ones. In the south of England, certain landed proprietors and well-to-do farmers put their heads together and composed 10 questions having to do with the correct interpretation of the Elizabethan Poor Law. They proceeded to present these questions to a famous jurist of the time, Sergeant Snigga, later a judge under James I, and asked for his expert opinion. Question 9. Some of the more wealthy farmers in the parish have devised a skillful mode by which all the troubles of executing this act, the 43rd of Elizabeth, might be avoided. They have proposed that we shall erect a prison in the parish, and then give notice to the neighborhood that if any persons are disposed to farm the poor of this parish, they do give in sealed proposals on a certain day of the lowest price at which they will take them off our hands, and that they will be authorized to refuse to anyone unless he be shut up in the aforesaid prison. The proposers of this plan conceive that there will be found in the adjoining counties persons who, being unwilling to labor and not possessing substance or credit to take a farm or ship so as to live without labor, may be induced to make a very advantageous offer to the parish. If any of the poor perish under the contractor's care, the sin will lie at his door, as the parish will have done its duty by them. We are, however, apprehensive that the present act, the 43rd of Elizabeth, will not warrant a prudential measure of this kind, but you are to learn that the rest of the freeholders of the county and of the adjoining county of B will very readily join in instructing their members to propose an act to enable the parish to contract with a person to lock up and work the poor, and to declare that if any person shall refuse to be so locked up and worked, he shall be entitled to no relief. This, it is hoped, will prevent persons in distress from wanting relief and be the means of keeping down the parishes. This is Blakely's History of Political Literature from the earliest times, 1855. Uh, Fletcher of Saltoun declared in the Scottish Parliament, the number of beggars in Scotland is estimated at no fewer than 200,000. The only remedy that I, a Republican on principle, can suggest is to restore the ancient state of villanage and to make slaves of all those who are unable to provide for their own subsistence. The decrease of villanage seems necessarily to have been the era of the origin of the poor. Manufactures and commerce are the true parents of our national poor. Like our Scott, that Republican out of principle, Eden, errs only on this point. It wasn't the abolition of serfdom, but rather the abolition of the agricultural workers' ownership of the land that turned him into a proletarian and eventually a pauper. This expropriation was carried out differently in France, whose Ordinance of Molina, 1571, and Edict of 1656 correspond to the English Poor Laws. 11. When Mr. Rogers wrote his History of Agriculture, he was a professor of political economy at the University of Oxford, the very center of Protestant orthodoxy. Yet in the book's preface, he stresses that the Reformation pauperized the majority of the people. Number 12, a letter to Sir T.C. Bunbury on the high price of provisions by a Suffolk gentleman, 1795. Even that fanatical advocate of the system of large farms, the author of the Inquiry into the Connection of Large Farms, etc., of 1773, I most lament the loss of our yeomanry, that set of men who really kept up the independence of this nation, and sorry I am to see their lands now in the hands of monopolizing lords, tenanted out to small farmers who hold their leases on such conditions as to be little better than vassals ready to attend a summons on every mischievous occasion. Number 13, on, among other things, the private morality of this bourgeois hero, the large grant of lands in Ireland to Lady Orkney in 1695, in a public instance of the king's affection and the lady's influence. Lady Orkney's endearing offices are supposed to have been Fueda Laborium Ministeria. The manuscript is titled The Character and Behavior of King William, Sunderland, etc., as represented original letters to the Duke of Shrewsbury from Somers, Halifax, Oxford, Secretary Vernon, etc. It abounds with curiosa. Editor's note, the Fueda Laborium Ministra is the Edict of 1597, whereby peasants who deserted their lords could be returned by force if they were caught within 5 years. Number 14, the illegal alienation of the crown estates, partly by sale and partly by gift, is a scandalous chapter in English history, a gigantic fraud on the nation. Newman, 1851. Read, for instance, number 15, read, for instance, Edmund Burke's pamphlet on the Ducal House of Bedford, whose offshoot, Lord John Russell, was the Tom Tit of liberalism. Number 16, the farmers forbid the cottagers to keep any living creatures besides themselves and children under the pretense that if they keep any beasts or poultry, they will steal from the farmers' barns for their support. They will also say, keep the cottagers poor and you will keep them industrious, etc. But the real fact, I believe, is that the farmers may have the whole right of common to themselves. Political inquiry into the consequences of enclosing wastelands of 1785. 17 is Eden Preface, Op Cit. 18, Capital Farms, 2 letters on the flour trade and the dearness of corn by a person in business, London of 1767. Number 19, Merchant Farms, an inquiry into the present high prices of provisions, 1767. Published anonymously, this fine book was written by the Reverend Nathaniel Forster. Number 20, Thomas Wright, A Short Address to the Public on the Monopoly of Small Farms, 1795. Number 21, Reverend Avington, Enquiry into the Reasons for or Against Enclosing Open Fields, London, 1772. Endnote 22, Reverend R. Price, Volume 2. One would do well to read Forster, Addington, Kent, Price, and James Anderson and compare their works with the pathetic sycophant's maundering that McCulloch offers in his catalog, The Literature of Political Economy, 1845. 43 is Price Up Sit. 147, Endnote 24, Price Up Sit, page 159. One thinks of ancient Rome here, quote, the rich gained possession of most of the undistributed land, and after a while were confident that no one would take it back from them. They used persuasion or force to buy or seize property which adjoined their own, or any other small holdings belonging to poor men, and came to operate great ranches instead of single farms. They employed slave hands and shepherds on these estates to avoid having freemen dragged off the land to serve in the army, and they derived great profit from this form of ownership too, as the slaves had many children and no liability to military service, and their numbers increased freely. For these reasons, the powerful were becoming extremely rich, and the number of slaves in the country was reaching large proportions, while the Italian people were suffering from depopulation and a shortage of men, worn down as they were by poverty and taxes and military service. And if they had any respite from these tribulations, they had no employment because the land was owned by the rich, who used slave farm workers instead of free men, unquote. Das Appian Romanische Bürgerkriege. Editor's note, The Civil Wars, translated by John Carter, 1996. This passage deals with the time before the Licinian Law. Military service, which dramatically accelerated the demise of the Roman plebeians, was also the main means Charlemagne used to transform free German peasants into serfs and bondsmen so rapidly, as if in a hothouse. Note 25, an inquiry into the connection between the present prices of provision, etc. Here is a similar argument that nevertheless goes in the opposite direction. Quote, working men are driven from their cottages and forced into the towns to seek for employment, but then a larger surplus is obtained, and thus capital is augmented. Perils of the Nation, 1843. Number 26, a king of England might as well claim to drive his subjects into the sea. Newman, 132. And note 27, Stewart says, if you compare the rent of these lands, here he mistakenly includes in his economic category the tribute the taxmen pay the chief of the clan, with the extent, it appears very small. If you compare it with the numbers fed upon the farm, you will find that an estate in the Highlands maintains perhaps 10 times as many people as another of the same value in a good and fertile province. Editor's note, in the traditional clan system, the taxmen paid tribute directly to the chief or laird and were actual holders of the land tax. Marx had written about them in his article Elections, Financial Clouds, the Duchess of Sutherland, and Slavery, which appeared in the New York Tribune in February 1853. Number 28, James Anderson, Observations on the Means of Exciting a Spirit of National Industry, 1777. 29. In 1860, some of the people who had violently expropriated were sent to Canada under false pretenses. A few fled into the mountains and to neighboring islands. They were pursued by the police, fought with them, and escaped. Number 30. In the Highlands of Scotland, said Buchanan, the Adam Smith commentator, in 1814, the ancient state of property is daily subverted. The landlord, without regard to the hereditary tenant, this category is wrongly applied here, now offers his lands to the highest bidder, who, if he is an improver, instantly adopts a new system of cultivation. The land, formerly overspread with small tenants or laborers, was peopled in proportion to its produce, but under the new system of improved cultivation and increased rents, the largest possible produce is obtained at the least possible expense, and the useless hands being with this view removed, the population is reduced not to what the land will maintain, but to what it will employ. The dispossessed tenants seek a subsistence in the manufacturing towns, etc. Unquote. David Buchanan, Observations on Etc., Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, 1814. Quote, the Scotch grandees dispossessed families as they would grub up coppice wood, and they treated villages and their people as Indians harassed with wild beasts do in their vengeance a jungle with tigers. Man shall be bartered for a fleece or a carcass of mutton, nay, held cheaper. Why? How much worse is it than the intention of the Moguls, who, when they had broken into the northern provinces of China, proposed in council to exterminate the inhabitants and convert the land into pasture. This proposal many Highland proprietors have effected in their own country against their own countrymen. George Ensor, An Inquiry Concerning the Population of Nations, 1818. Note 31. To express her sympathy for the Negro slaves of the American public, the current Duchess of Sutherland hosted Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In a grand style, of course, the Duchess and her fellow aristocrats shrewdly forgot this sympathy during the Civil War, when every noble English heart beat for the slave owners. As the visit was taking place, I published an article in the New York Tribune depicting the conditions in which the Sutherland slaves lived and worked. Some excerpts were reprinted by Carey in The Slave Trade, 1853. My article was reprinted in a Scottish newspaper, and it prompted a lively polemic between that newspaper and the Sutherland sycophants. Note 32. Readers will find interesting material on this fish trade in David Urquhart's Portfolio New Series Addendum to the second edition. In the posthumous work cited above, Nassau W. Sr. calls the proceedings in Sutherlandshire one of the most beneficial clearings on record. 33. Note added to the second edition. The deer forests in Scotland don't contain even a single tree. The sheep are driven from bare hills and the deer are driven onto them. And this is called a deer forest. No forest culture here. And note 34, Robert Summers, Letters from the Highlands, or the Famine of 1847, published in 1848. These letters first appeared in the Times. Naturally, English political economists cited overpopulation to explain the Gaels' famine. In any case, they were pressing on their means of nourishment. The clearing of estates, as it is called in German Bauerlegen, became an important phenomenon in Germany too, particularly after the 30 Years' War. And as late as 1790, it led to peasant revolts in electoral Saxony. Bauernlegen was especially widespread in the eastern part of Germany. In most of the Prussian provinces, it was Frederick II who first secured property rights for the peasants. After conquering Silesia, he forced the landowners to rebuild huts, barns, and so on, and to supply the peasants with cattle and equipment. He needed soldiers for his army and taxpayers for his treasury. The following lines by Mirabeau, who admired Frederick, convey what a nice life peasants led under Frederick's financial system and his governmental mishmash of despotism, bureaucracy, and feudalism. Quote, Flax is one of the great sources of wealth for the farmer in northern Germany. Unfortunately for the human race, it's only a resource against misery and not a means of well-being. Direct taxes, drudgery, servitude of every kind crush the German farmer, who still pays indirect taxes on everything he buys. And to make matters worse, he dares not sell his produce where and how he wants. He dares not buy what he needs from merchants who could sell it to him at a better price. All these causes generally ruin him, and he would find himself unable to pay direct taxes when due without spinning. It provides him with the resource while keeping his wife, children, servants, valets, and himself busy. But what a hard life it is, even with this support. In the summer, he works like a convict, plowing and harvesting. He goes to bed at 9 o'clock and gets up at 2 just to keep up with the work. In winter, he should repair his strength with more rest, but he'll run out of grain for bread and next year's sowing if he gets rid of the goods he needs to sell to pay taxes. Spinning is therefore necessary to make up for this loss. It must be done with the utmost assiduity. So in winter, the peasant goes to bed at midnight at 1 o'clock and gets up at 5 or 6, or he goes to bed at 9 and gets up at 2 every day of his life except Sunday. This excess of wakefulness and work wears down human nature, and this is why men and women grow old much earlier in the countryside than in the cities. Addendum to the second edition in March of 1866, or 18 years after the work by Somers cited above was published, Leon Levy lectured before the Society of Arts on the transformation of sheep pastures into deer forests. Here he depicted the continuing desolation of Scotland's highlands. Among other things, he said, the landed proprietors found out that the land left wild and uncultivated, land dedicated to deer and rabbit, pays better than land used as sheep walks, or dedicated to cultivation. And the landowners have acted on this new discovery by at once turning out the sheep as they once turned out the men from their estates and welcoming the new tenants, the wild beasts and the feathered birds. One can walk from the Earl of Dalhousie's estates in Forfarshire to John O'Groat's without ever leaving forest land. In many of these woods, the fox, the wild cat, the marten, the polecat, the weasel, and the alpine hare are common, whilst the rabbit, the squirrel, and the rat have lately made their way into the country. Immense tracts of land, much of which is described in the statistical account of Scotland as having a pasturage in richness and extent of very superior description, are thus shut out from all cultivation and improvement, and are solely devoted to the sport of a few persons for a very brief period of the year. Unquote. The London Economist of 1866 says, amongst the items of news in a Scotch paper of last week, one of the finest sheep farms in Sutherlandshire, for which a rent of £1,200 was recently offered, on the expiry of the existing lease this year is to be converted into a deer forest. Here we see the modern instincts of feudalism, operating pretty much as they did when the Norman conqueror destroyed 36 villages to create the new forest. 2 million of acres have been laid totally waste, embracing within their area some of the most fertile lands of Scotland. The grass of Glen Tilt were among the most nutritive in the country of Perth. The deer forest of Ben Alder was by far the best grazing ground in the wide district of Badenoch. As part of the Black Mount Forest was the best pasture for black-faced sheep in Scotland. Some idea may be formed of the ground laid waste for purely sporting purposes in Scotland from the fact that it embraced an area larger than the whole county of Perth. The resources of the forest of Ben Alder might give some idea of the loss sustained from these forced desolations. The ground would pasture 15,000 sheep, and as it was, not more than 1/30th part of the whole forest ground in Scotland. All that forest land was totally unproductive. It might thus have well been submerged under the waters of the German Ocean. Such extemporized wildernesses or deserts ought to be put down by the decided interferences of the legislature. Number 35. The author of the Essay on Trade, 1770, remarks, Quote, in the reign of Edward VI, indeed, the English seem to have set in good earnest about encouraging manufactures and employing the poor. This we learn from a remarkable statute which runs thus, quote, that all vagrants shall be branded, etc., unquote. Number 36, note added to the second edition. In his Utopia, Thomas More says, quote, thus that one greedy, insatiable glutton, a frightful plague to his native country, may enclose thousands of acres within a single fence. The tenants are ejected, and some are stripped of their belongings by trickery or brute force, or wearied by constant harassment, or driven to sell them. One way or another, these wretched people, men, women, husbands, wives, orphans, widows, parents with little children, and entire families, poor but numerous, since farming requires many hands, are forced to move out. They leave the only homes familiar to them and can find no place to go. Since they must leave at once without waiting for a proper buyer, they sell for a pittance all their household goods, which would not bring much in any case. When that little money is gone, and is soon spent in wandering from place to place, what finally remains for them but to steal and so be hanged, justly no doubt, or to wander and beg? And if they go tramping, they are jailed as idle vagrants. They would be glad to work, but they can find no one who will hire them. The editor's note is additionally published in 1516 in Latin. It's the English translation, Thomas More Utopia, etc. Of these poor wanderers about whom More says that they were forced to steal, quote, 72,000 great and petty thieves were put to death during the reign of Henry VIII, unquote. In Elizabeth's day, quote, rogues were trussed up apace, and there was not one year commonly wherein 300 or 400 of them were not devoured and eaten up by the gallows, unquote. According to this same stripe, 40 persons were executed over the course of 1 year in Somersetshire. 35 robbers were branded on the hand, 37 were whipped, and 183 were discharged as, quote, most wicked and desperate persons, unquote. And yet, he believes that not even the fifth part of the felonies committed in the county were brought to trial, either from the remissness of the magistrates or the foolish lenity of the people. He adds, quote, the other counties of England were in no better condition than Somersetshire, and many of them were even in a worse one, unquote. 37. Whenever the legislature attempts to regulate the differences between masters and their workmen, its counselors are always the masters, says Adam Smith. The spirit of the laws is property, says Linguet. 38. Sophisms of free trade by a barrister, 1850. He adds maliciously, quote, we were ready enough to interfere for the employer. Can nothing now be done for the employed? Unquote. 39. A clause in the statute 2, James I, tells us that certain clothiers who also worked as justices of the peace used the authority that they had in the latter capacity to dictate the official tariff of wages in their own workshops. In Germany, we find many statutes for keeping wages low, especially after the 30 Years' War. Quote, the dearth of servants and workers in the depopulated areas caused the landed proprietors much consternation. Villagers were prohibited from renting rooms to single men and women. All the latter were to be reported to the authorities and put into prison if they wouldn't become servants, even if they were employed at some other work, say planting seeds for the peasants for a daily wage, or even buying and selling grain. For a century, the decrees of German princes complained bitterly about the evil and impudent rabble who refused to accept painful conditions and content themselves with the wage established by law. Individual landowners aren't allowed to pay more than the amount set by the state, and yet after the war, labor conditions were frequently better than they would be a century later. The farm servants of Silesia got to consume meat twice a week in 1652, but in the 19th century, there are districts where they eat it only 3 times a year. In addition, wages were higher after the war than they would be in the centuries that followed, unquote. Number 40, some remaining bits of the anti-coalition legislation were abolished in 1859. Addendum to the second edition, a law enacted in 1871 abolished all anti-coalition laws and officially recognized trade unions, but in a supplementary act promulgated on the same day, an act to amend the criminal law related to violence, threats, and molestation, the anti-coalition laws were restored in a new form. More specifically, these acts had the following effects. Workers who use certain means of battle against their masters are to be prosecuted according to special criminal legislation. And the masters themselves are to apply this legislation in their capacity as justices of the peace. 2 years earlier, the same House of Commons and the same Gladstone, who invented new crimes for the working class within the law of 1871, approved a second reading of a bill that abolished embarrassing special legislation against the workers, doing so in a most honest way. The second reading was clever. The matter was dragged out over 2 years until the, quote, great liberal party, unquote, formed a coalition with its rivals that made it strong enough to act as a front against their common enemy, the working class. Note 41, Article 1 of this law reads, quote, since the abolition of all kinds of associations of citizens of the same estate and profession is one of the foundations of the French Constitution, it is forbidden to reestablish them under any pretext and in any form whatsoever, unquote. Article 4 declares that, quote, if citizens belonging to the same professions, arts, and crafts hold deliberations and make joint agreements tending to refuse by mutual consent or to grant only at a determined price the assistance of their industry or their labor, the aforementioned deliberations and agreements shall be declared unconstitutional, prejudicial to liberty and to the declarations of the rights of man, etc., unquote. This is treated as a felony, just as in the old statutes of laborers as 1791. Let's see, Boucher and Roux, 42. 43, Harrison says in his description of England, although peradventure 4 pounds of old rent shall be improved to 40, 50, or even 100 pounds, yet will the farmer think his gains very small towards the end of his term, if he have not 6 or 7 years' rent lying by him. Number 44, note added to the second edition on the question of how money's depreciation in the 16th century affected different social class. See a compendium or brief examination of certain ordinary complaints or of diverse of our countrymen in these our days by W.S. Gentleman, 1581. Because this work is written in the form of a dialogue, it was long thought to come from Shakespeare's pen. And it was republished under his name as late as 1751. Its author is, in fact, William Stafford. In one part, the knight reasons as follows. Knight, quote, you, my neighbor, the husbandman, you, Master Mercer, and you, Goodman Copper, with other artificers, may save yourself metly well, for as much as all things are dearer than they were, so much do you arise in the price of your wares and occupations that ye sell again. But we have nothing to sell whereby we might advance ye price thereof to countervail those things that we must buy again. Unquote. In another place, the knight asks the doctor, quote, I pray you, what be these sorts that ye mean? And first, of those that ye think should have no loss hereby, unquote. Doctor, I mean all these things that live by buying and selling, for as they buy dear, they sell thereafter. Knight, what is the next sort that ye may say would win by it, doctor? Marry, all such as have taking or firms in their own mensurance, i.e. cultivation at the old rent, for where they pay after the old rate, they sell after the new. That is, they pay for their land good, cheap, and sell all things growing thereof dear, unquote. Knight, what sort is that which ye say should have greater loss hereby than these men had profit? Doctor, it is all noblemen, gentlemen, and all other that live either by a stinted rent or stipend, and do not manure, cultivate the ground, or do occupy no buying and selling, unquote. Number 45. In France, the régisseur, or steward, who collected the dues for the feudal lords during the early part of the Middle Ages, soon became an homme d'affaires, that is, a man of business who used extortion, cheating, and so on to swindle his way to the position of capitalist. Sometimes these regisseurs were refined gentlemen. For instance, quote, this is the account which Monsieur Jacques de Thorez, knight and chatelain near Besançon, delivered to the Lord who administers the accounts at Dijon for Monsignor the Duke and Count of Burgundy of the rents belonging to the aforementioned castle since the 25th of December 1359 until the 28th day of December 1360. In France, as in England, the great feudal territories were divided into countless small homesteads, but under conditions incomparably more unfavorable for the people. Farms, fermes or terriers, emerged during the 14th century. They grew in number continuously, far exceeding 100,000. They paid rents varying from 1/12 to 1/5 of their product in money or in natura. These farms were fiefs, subfields, and so on, fiefs, arrière fiefs, depending on the value and extent of the domains, many of which contained only a few acres, arpents. But these terriens had rights of jurisdiction to some degree over those who lived on the land. There were 4 degrees. One can imagine how these small tyrants oppressed the agricultural folks. Montaigne says that there used to be 160,000 courts in France, whereas today 4,000 of them, including local courts, suffice. 46, Paris 1838, so 47, a point that Sir James Stewart emphasizes 48. I will allow you, says the capitalist, the honor of serving me on the condition that you will give me the little that you have left for the pains I shall take to command you. Rousseau, 1760. 49. Mirabeau. The fact that Mirabeau regarded separate workshops as more economical and more productive than the combined ones, and saw the latter as artificial hothouse plants cultivated by the government, can be explained by the condition of many continental manufacturing workshops back then. Number 50, 20 pounds of wool converted unobtrusively into the yearly clothing of a laborer's family by its own industry in the eternals of other work. That makes no show, but bring it to market, send it to factory, hence to the broker, thence to the dealer, and you will have great commercial operations and nominal capital engaged to the amount of 20 times its value. The working class is thus immersed to support a wretched factory population, a parasitical shopkeeping class, and a fictitious commercial, monetary, and financial system. Number 51, Cromwell's time represents an exception. During the Republic, all strata of the English people lifted themselves out of the degraded condition they were reduced to under the 52. Large-scale war arose when machinery was introduced from the manufacturing system proper and the destruction of the rural or domestic forms of the manufacturing workshop. I have far exceeded my time here, so and yes, there's a whole bunch more notes. Let me switch to the which you can read yourselves. Here's chapter 4's editor's notes. Chapter 24, the so-called original or primitive accumulation. Original accumulation is sometimes translated into English as primitive accumulation, but primitive is a strong and unnecessary interpretation of the German or, which indexes the earliest protoform of something without implying a simpler or less sophisticated thing. Accumulation is original when value is extracted from people and the earth without recompense, equivalent to theft or pillage. Though it goes by more pleasant names, it is a first accumulation without precedent or contract, as well as the origin of all future accumulation. In this section, Marx makes the critical distinction between what he sees as the essential mode of accumulation under capital, wage labor, and the many other ways capitalism will have appropriated and expropriated resources in order to establish wage labor as the standard in the first place, while in the process rooting out other social systems in order to come to dominance. For that reason, the section touches on some of the most violent experiences perpetrated by Europe and its satellites on its own populations and land, as well as on other peoples and parts of the planet over the last 500 years. Marx begins by critiquing prior political economists on the topic when he uses the epithet so-called and puts original or sprüchlich into quotation marks. He is referring to the main to Adam Smith, whose account has roots in the political economy of James Stewart. An inquiry into the principles of political economy, 1767. In the edition Marx owned of Smith's Wealth of Nations, we read, quote, as the accumulation of stock is previously necessary for carrying on this great improvement in the productive powers of labor, so that the accumulation naturally leads to this improvement, unquote. Prior to labor becoming productive, accumulation has to happen, and not through production. Nothing is natural about this previous accumulation, Marx retorts, just as nothing is natural about the capitalistic labor relations it makes possible. Nevertheless, Smith is not wrong about the need for capital processes to get started. A prior accumulation of materials, enough means of production to employ enough laborers is certainly necessary. Beyond that, capitalists also need an accumulation of disposable labor, workers who have been freed from other obligations and made ready for the productive work that is their destiny. Marx makes it clear that a proletariat has to be created. It is not born, but forged by force and disciplined to serve its new boss. An ever larger stock of land is also needed, dedicated to producing the food, to produce the mass of laborers who no longer produce their own means of subsistence. This is why it is misleading to translate ursprünglich as primitive. Original accumulation is neither undeveloped nor simple, and its savagery should not be compared to anything other than itself. European legal violence, or ursprünglich Gewalt, original violence. Original accumulation counts as a leap in Marx's explanation of the capital system's birth. In earlier texts, such as the Communist Manifesto, Marx with Engels envisioned a more sequential chain of events where feudal society gave way almost by fate to industrial society. Industrialized Europe prepared the world for the post-capitalist society to come. Marx began to think through a new account of the capital system's nascency in value, price, and profit of 1865. In those lectures, he said directly what he says here indirectly, with added quotation marks around the phrase. He wrote that what the economists call the previous or original accumulation should in fact be called original expropriation. Marx's revised concept of a, quote, ursprünglich accumulation as, close quote, as proletarianization through force has provoked controversy since at least 1913, when Rosa Luxemburg wrote a renowned critique and extension of Marx's theory entitled The Accumulation of Capital. Obviously, original forms of accumulation still occur in ongoing events of colonialization and imperialism, as Luxemburg argues in her book. The capital system cannot exist without inputs continuously coming in from the outside. In addition to exploitation within its precincts, capital continuously ransacks the world around it. Editor's note, lowercase Roman numeral 2. Marx is referring to Adolf Thiers and his work De la Propriété of 1848, a journalist, a historian, pro-revolution activist in 1830 and 1848. Thiers did, in fact, become a statesman during the France Second Empire. Number 3, clair obscur is a French expression meaning half-ate. Number 4, the great feudal wars that Marx refers to here were credited with bringing to a definitive and a political, juridical, economic, and social system that, according to the historiography of Marx's time, was in effect in Europe from roughly the 9th to the 15th century. That system only came to be called feudalism well after it ended. Montesquieu gave an important boost to the name and concept in 1748 in De l'Esprit des Lois, The Spirit of the Laws. By Marx's time, the historical category feudalism had come to stand for a relationship between property and owner, which is in essence, the exchange of military protection by lords for land from the king. And in schematic outline, feudal power relations began with a landholding, the use of which was transformed from social stratum to social stratum by a differing fee. A fief could be given by the king to a noble, for instance, and the noble would owe the king a fee of military service, because the king had the obligation and the dire need to protect the lands under his sovereignty from foreign invasion. Parts of that same land could be subsequently deeded by the noble to vassals in exchange for fealty and other considerations. The land would then be worked by tenant peasants who benefited by being able to live on it and keep the equivalent to their subsistence in crops. However problematic the idea is historically, the term feudal was critically important to Marx throughout his career as a social theorist. It helped him articulate the difference The French Revolution made to political life, that is, on the Jewish question in 1843, it became a fixture in the materialist concept of history in the German ideology of 1845 to 46, and it gave him a weapon against political economists and pseudo-critics like Proudhon, who thought the bourgeois system was better, the poverty of philosophy of 1847. In Capital, the term feudal is used in all these ways as well. But a critical distinction is developed between the feudal mode of exploitation, which was about status, and the capitalist mode, which was about profit, and between the ostentatious feudal lord and the capitalist whose luxury spending was always calculated against capital returns. The English wars Marx refers to here culminated in the Wars of the Roses, an 18th century designation for civil wars in the 15th century that divided the loyalties of the people, greatly weakened the feudal system, and led to its overthrow by the Tudors, under whose first ruler, Henry VII, power became more centralized in the monarchy. Number 5, pauper ubique Jacque is a Latin phrase from Ovid, meaning the poor man is oppressed everywhere. Number 6, Marx is referring to a 1597 Russian edict according to which peasants who fled from a noble estate and its labor conditions were to be tracked and, if caught, forced to return. Number 7, Republican Revolution refers to what historians commonly refer to as the English Civil War of 1642 to 1652, which named the struggles between supporters of parliamentary rule and supporters of absolute monarchy. Number 8, enclosure of the commons refers to a historical process in which land was subtracted from shared use and made private, exclusive to one owner. The gradual mass dispossession of land by this means had a disastrous effect on small farmers who, without free use of meadows and fallow fields, could not afford to keep livestock. The consensus among historians is that in the Middle Ages, nearly all land in England included some common use rights. By 1600 or so, less than one-third of it did, and by 1850, virtually all land had become private. Enclosure generally refers to the fencing or walling off of grazing land that had been freely usable by small landowners and that had been managed cooperatively. With the closing of the commons, a cooperative mode of political organization also passed away. Across this history, fences became laws and rights to land were eventually removed in huge swaths by acts of parliament. Companion processes to enclosure were consolidation and clearing. Enclosure enabled a single landowner to make many smaller tracts into a large estate, consolidating them. It also performed the function of removing peasants from the land, clearing them, and thus freeing them for wage labor, which they sometimes performed on the very estates where they had once grazed their cattle for free. Number 9, the original English line couldn't be located. The English here is a translation of Marx's German sentence, which is most likely a paraphrase. Number 10, quite a few of the quotations in this section contain sentences that are more paraphrase than direct quotation. The quotation given here goes further in this and appears to be mostly a paraphrase. Number 9, in 1745 and 1746, the followers of Charles Edward Louis Philip Casimir Stuart, the Pretender, made their final concerted effort to have him installed as King of England. Number 12, that was number 11. Number 12, this act was promulgated in 1536. Number 13, here is one of those places where Marx is translating simultaneously, amplifies, and compresses to the point of being close enough to paraphrase, i.e., far enough from the source text to warrant being translated. In other words, the English quotation given has been adapted to match the version Marx provides, where the line, quote, taken away from their wives, children's parents, friends, and comforts, unquote, is rendered as ihren Familien gewaltsam entrissen, which translate into English as violently torn from their families. Number 14, tante mollis erat is an abbreviated form of the line from the Aeneid. That means the effort that it took to establish the Roman people. Okay, we got to the end. No questions have followed. Let me stop share and end the live stream. Thank you very much. This completes chapter 24 of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, the 2024 edition by the two Pauls, and we will get to 25 next week, Saturday. Tomorrow at 2, we'll try to join the class unity session on the war economy with I think it's a discussion of C. Wright Mills's work. So I will now end the live stream and thank you for your attention. This is the Autonomous Collective